cold. The granite counter pressed sharp against my ribs, a harsh white light bleeding from the tablet screen onto the dark wood floor, ice clinking in a glass somewhere far away. Laughter. Someone was laughing. The smell of roasted rosemary and burnt sugar hung heavy in the kitchen air, but it only made my stomach pitch. My fingers felt numb, too heavy to lift. The words on the glowing rectangle swam together. Black text, white background, numbers. So many numbers. Blink, breathe, and focus. I forced my eyes to lock onto the top row of the document. Monthly transfers. Wire routing codes. The dates went back years, starting in 2019, with regular intervals scheduled always on the 15th of the month. The amounts were identical, pulling directly from the joint savings account I managed for our household. My husband always said he handled the heavy lifting with our investment portfolio, and I let him. My name is Eleanor. At 52, after nearly 30 years working as a pediatric nurse, charting vital signs is second nature to me. Spotting a failing pulse is just part of the job. But looking at this screen, my brain refused to process the data. I scrolled down, the pad of my thumb slipped on the smooth glass twice before it finally caught dragging the page up. The spreadsheet ended, giving way to a scanned copy of a property deed, and there it was. A house in Sedona. A signature resting at the bottom of the page. David's sprawling, messy cursive stood out in black ink. Beside it sat another signature. Familiar loops. The way the lowercase letters tilted slightly to the left. A signature I had seen on every birthday card I had ever received since childhood. My younger sister, Marianne. They bought a house together, joint tenants with right of survivorship. The air in the kitchen turned to water. My lungs forgot how to pull it in. I gripped the edge of the granite island so hard my knuckles ached, anchoring myself to the only solid thing left in the room. In the living room, David laughed again, a rich, booming sound that bounced off the vaulted ceilings we had finally paid off last year. Marianne's voice drifted in right after his high and sweet, asking if anyone wanted more wine. The floor under my feet felt like it was tilting. I did not scream. Tears refused to come. Reaching over, I locked the tablet screen and slid it exactly where David had left it next to the coffee maker. Smoothing the front of my blouse, I took a slow, deliberate breath and walked toward the laughter. The wind coming off the frozen Mississippi River carried a bitter chill that cut straight through my old wool coat. Monday morning in downtown Minneapolis looked gray and unforgiving. I kept my head down, pushing through the heavy glass doors of the building on Hennepin Avenue. The lobby smelled like wet boots and floor wax. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 7th floor. The metal box groaned and shuddered its way up, a slow ascent that gave me too much time to think. I held a thick manila envelope against my chest. Inside was the copy of the police report I had filed on Sunday morning. Inside was the time-stamped photograph my friend Petra had taken of me standing in my own living room dripping in red wine. Inside was my life reduced to evidence. The doors slid open. Margot Pryor's law office did not look like the sleek corporate firms on television. The waiting area was small. A massive pothos plant trailed down from a high bookshelf, its green leaves bright against the dark wood paneling. The air smelled of old paper and freshly brewed dark roast coffee. It was the kind of coffee made in a French press, rich and earthy, completely different from the burnt drip we served in the break room at the pediatric clinic. Margot sat behind a massive oak desk. She wore a tailored gray blazer and thick black glasses that magnified her sharp dark eyes. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back tightly. She did not stand to shake my hand. She simply nodded toward the heavy wooden chair opposite her. I sat down, placing the manila envelope on the desk between us. I told her everything. I kept my voice measured and clinical, the exact tone I used when briefing an attending physician about a critical patient. I detailed the birthday party on Saturday night. I described the 23 guests holding their breath. I explained how Della poured her wine down the front of my white cotton dress, slowly and deliberately, while telling me I did not belong in my own home. I recounted the 5 words my 8-year-old daughter had spoken into the silence. Mommy already packed our bags. Margot listened without interrupting. She pulled the photograph out of the envelope and studied the dark stains spreading across the white fabric. Then she folded her hands on the desk. She looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. "How long have you been married?" she asked. 10 years, I replied. "How much money has your mother-in-law given you and your husband during those 10 years? I stared at the edge of the oak desk. The radiator in the corner hissed softly, pushing dry heat into the room. I tried to calculate the numbers in my head. I do not have the exact total. Maybe 90,000. 100,000. Margot lowered her chin, looking at me over the rim of her thick glasses. Was any of it given without conditions? I opened my mouth to say yes automatically. The word formed on my tongue built by a decade of forced gratitude. Then I closed my mouth. I looked out the window behind her. The river below was a sheet of gray ice, cracking and shifting under the winter sun. I thought about the massive down payment for our house. Della had handed us the check in a sealed envelope, smiling widely before demanding a spare key to the front door. She had said family should always be able to reach each other. I thought about the time she paid for Hazel's private school tuition, only to use that payment a month later to demand weekend visitations on her own terms. I thought about the trip to Colorado to see my sister, the trip I canceled because Della warned me she would reconsider her financial support if I took Hazel out of state without her permission. "No," I said, and my voice sounded hollow in the quiet office. "I do not think so." "Do you have documentation of those conditions?" Margot asked. I reached into my leather purse. My fingers brushed against smooth, cold leather. It was the small blue notebook Della had left on my kitchen counter after she stormed out of the party. She never forgot her belongings, but the shock of Hazel's words had made her careless. I pulled the blue ledger out and placed it gently on the desk next to the manila envelope. "She kept her own records," I explained. "She forgot it at my house." Margot picked up the little book. She opened the cover. The room grew completely silent except for the ticking of a wall clock. I watched her eyes track back and forth across the pages. I knew what she was reading. Neat columns written in blue ink. Dates on the left. Exact dollar amounts in the middle. On the right side, precise conditions written out like clauses in a business contract. I watched Margot turn 3 pages. She stopped reading, closed the book, and placed her hand flat against the leather cover. "Robin, the attorney, said, leaning forward. "What your mother-in-law has been doing has a legal name. It is called coercive control. These payments were never gifts. These are transactions, and they are designed specifically to maintain absolute power over your household. The wine incident is terrible, but it is just a symptom. This ledger," she tapped the blue cover twice, "is the disease." My chest tightened. The breath caught in my throat. Coercive control. For 10 years, I had swallowed my discomfort. For 10 years, I had told myself she was just being generous, just being protective, just being a mother. The spare key. The unannounced visits while I was nursing. The constant, suffocating oversight. I was not crazy. I was not an ungrateful daughter-in-law. The entire pattern had a name, and hearing another human being say it out loud felt like someone had finally pulled a heavy stone off my chest. "Here is what I strongly recommend," Margot continued. "We file a petition for an order for protection under Minnesota Statute 518B. 1. The wine incident qualifies as 5th-degree assault. That gives us the immediate legal trigger. But the sustained pattern documented in this ledger, the financial manipulation, the unauthorized entries into your home, the attempts to isolate you from your own family, that forms our foundation. A judge will look at this and see a system of abuse, not just a one-time loss of temper." My hands felt cold. "Will a judge really grant that I have handled 47 of these cases?" Margot said calmly. "When a client walks in with documentation like this, an accounting ledger maintained by the abuser themselves, it works. We will ask for a temporary order first. If the judge grants it, she will be legally barred from contacting you or coming near your home until the full hearing." I nodded slowly. Margot made copies of the ledger pages and handed the original back to me, explaining the importance of maintaining the chain of custody. When I left her office and stepped back into the elevator, the heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing me in. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel panel. I was 39 years old. My hair was messy. My eyes had dark circles under them. I wore shoes from a discount store. Yet for the very first time since the day I married Scott Ashford, the woman looking back at me did not drop her gaze. Monday evening settled over my house with a thick, heavy silence. The smell of bleach and lemon cleaner lingered in the kitchen. I had scrubbed the granite counters and the oak floors until my shoulders burned. The front door unlocked with a loud click, and Scott walked in. He dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. The sharp clatter made me flinch. He walked into the kitchen slowly, his shoulders slumped. The skin around his eyes looked bruised and gray. He had spent the entire afternoon at his mother's house in Edina. He leaned back against the refrigerator and pushed both hands deep into his pockets. He stared at the floorboards near my feet. "Mom says she is sorry about the wine," he said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "She wants to come by this weekend to apologize to you and Hazel in person." I stood at the sink with my hands resting on the cold steel edge. The water had been running, but I reached out and shut the faucet off. The silence rushed back in, ringing in my ears. I turned around to face my husband. She can apologize through my attorney, I said. Scott's head snapped up, his hands jerked out of his pockets. He bumped against the refrigerator door, his eyes wide with disbelief. An attorney, Robin, please. It was a glass of wine. She just lost her temper. She lost her temper in front of 23 people, I replied. My voice did not rise. It stayed steady and low, matching the rhythm of a heartbeat monitor. She told me I do not belong in my own home. And it was not the first time, Scott. It was the 101st time. She is my mother, he pleaded. He held those words up like a shield. It was the exact same shield he had used to deflect every uncomfortable conversation for the past 10 years. He used it to avoid conflict. He used it to avoid making a choice. And I am filing for an order for protection against her, I told him. Scott physically recoiled. He took a step backward, looking at me as if a stranger had wandered into his kitchen. You do not need a court order against my mother. We can just talk to her. We can sit down and set boundaries. Real boundaries this time. I have been trying to set boundaries for 10 years, I said, taking a step toward the kitchen island. She has a spare key to our house. She chose our daughter's school. She decides when we are allowed to travel. She kept a ledger, Scott. She wrote down every single dollar she ever gave us, and she attached a condition to every single payment. Boundaries do not work with someone who fundamentally believes they own you. He did not argue. He just looked completely lost. I stared at his face, tracing the familiar lines around his mouth. I loved him. I knew he was not a malicious man. He was simply paralyzed. His entire life had been constructed around the central rule that keeping his mother happy was the only way to survive. But I could not afford to be paralyzed anymore. Upstairs, Hazel was sleeping quietly in her room. My brave 8-year-old daughter had stood up in front of a crowded room and spoken the truth because she realized no one else was going to protect us. I refused to let Scott use his mother as an excuse to do nothing. His silence was a choice, and it was a choice that left me standing alone. He turned his head away, unable to hold my gaze. He walked out of the kitchen without saying another word. I listened to his heavy footsteps moving across the living room. The hardwood floors creaked under his weight. They were the same oak floors Della had paid for, the same floors she had demanded the right to pick the stain color for. Tuesday morning brought a pale, thin sunlight that barely warmed the kitchen windows. I stood by the coffee maker, holding a warm ceramic mug between both hands. My phone sat on the granite counter beside the sink. The screen suddenly lit up, vibrating against the stone with an angry buzz. The caller identification flashed brightly. Della Ashford. My heart immediately picked up speed, knocking hard against my ribs. My breath grew shallow. I did not reach for the phone. I just watched it vibrate, sliding a fraction of an inch across the counter. It rang 4 times before the call dropped. The kitchen was quiet for 1 full minute. Then a small notification chime signaled a new voicemail. Minnesota law only required one-party consent to record a conversation, but the carrier system recorded voicemails automatically. I set my coffee mug down. My fingers trembled slightly as I unlocked the screen and pressed play on the audio file. I put the phone on the speaker setting. Della's voice filled my kitchen. It was soft, incredibly slow, and perfectly controlled. It was the voice of a woman who had never been told no in her entire adult life. Robin, I hear you have been talking to a lawyer. That is very theatrical of you. She paused. The silence in the recording stretched out thick with condescension. Let me remind you of something important. The down payment on your house came directly from me. The hardwood floors, the expensive kitchen renovation, Hazel's private school tuition. All me. If you honestly think a judge in this county will side with a girl from a trailer park over a woman who gave her absolutely everything she has, you are far more delusional than I thought. Call me back. We can sort this out like family. The recording ended with a sharp click. I stood completely still. I listened to the message 3 consecutive times. The first time the audio played, a cold wave of fear washed over my skin. She already knew about Margot. She was not hiding her power. She was weaponizing it. The second time the audio played, I focused on her exact words, girl from a trailer park. A hot, bright anger flared behind my eyes. It burned away the cold fear instantly. She saw my background not as a triumph of hard work, but as a permanent stain she could use to humiliate me. By the third time the message played, my hands had stopped trembling completely. My mind felt remarkably clear. I tapped the share button on the screen and forwarded the audio file directly to Margot's office email. I quickly typed out a text message to follow it. She just threatened me. She explicitly mentioned the down payment as leverage. Is this admissible evidence? 20 minutes later, my phone chimed again. It was a reply from Margot. Forward everything to me immediately. Do not delete a single message or email from her. This is gold. I locked my phone and slid it into my pocket. I looked down at the floor beneath my feet. The oak board stretched out toward the hallway. $2,100. Condition attached. I walked over to the spot where I had been standing on Saturday night. The dark red wine stain was still there, faded but visible, soaked deep into the natural grain of the wood where no amount of scrubbing could remove it. I stared down at that ugly mark. Every single square inch of this house carried Della's heavy invisible watermark. I made a silent promise to myself right then. When this legal battle was finally over, I was going to tear these oak floors out with my own hands. I would pay for new ones using my own salary. Even if it drained my hidden savings account down to nothing, I was going to buy my own ground to stand on. The Hennepin County Courthouse smelled of industrial floor cleaner, damp wool, and the nervous sweat of 1,000 people waiting for a judge to tell them what their future looked like. Wednesday morning brought a bitter wind outside, but inside the heavy stone building the air felt stagnant and overheated. I sat on a hard wooden bench in the hallway next to Margot Pryor. My hands rested in my lap. I kept my fingers laced tightly together to stop them from picking at the cuticles on my thumbs. Margot wore a dark navy suit today. She held a thick stack of papers resting on top of her leather briefcase. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, constant vibration that settled right behind my eyes. "This is the petition for the order for protection," Margot said. Her voice was perfectly level, cutting through the ambient noise of the busy corridor. "We are filing under Minnesota Statute, Chapter 518B.01. I have outlined the grounds clearly." I looked down at the top page. Black text on white paper. My name was printed as the petitioner. Della Ashford was listed as the respondent. Seeing her name printed in that formal legal context made the breath catch in my throat. "The primary trigger is the 5th-degree assault from Saturday night." Margot continued tapping the paper with a silver pen. "But the real weight of this petition comes from the pattern, the ledger you provided, the voicemails containing direct threats regarding your financial stability, the spare key she used to enter your home, the isolation tactics." "What happens after I sign this?" I asked. My voice sounded incredibly small, swallowed up by the high ceilings of the courthouse hallway. "The court will review the petition for a temporary order within 24 to 72 hours, Margot explained. She handed me the silver pen. "Because of the physical assault element and the documented threats, I am confident they will grant it. If they do, she will be legally prohibited from contacting you. She cannot come to your house. She cannot approach Hazel. That temporary order stays in place until we have the formal hearing in front of a judge, which will likely be scheduled 2 to 3 weeks from now." I stared at the pen in my hand. It was a heavy, expensive metal pen. It felt 10 times heavier than the cheap plastic pens I used at the clinic to sign patient charts. Signing a medical chart meant I was confirming a diagnosis. Signing this paper meant I was dropping a bomb in the exact center of my own family. I thought about what Della would do when a uniformed police officer arrived at her massive house in Edina to serve her with a court order. Would she laugh in the officer's face? Would she be outraged? Would she immediately pick up her phone and call Scott, demanding he put a stop to this nonsense? She would definitely call Scott. She would twist the narrative until she was the bleeding victim and I was the ungrateful, unstable daughter-in-law trying to tear her family apart. For 10 long years, the fear of Della's reaction had governed every single decision I made. I chose my words carefully to avoid her passive-aggressive sighs. I dressed a certain way to avoid her backhanded compliments. I let her dictate the rhythm of our lives just to keep the peace. But sitting in that echoing hallway holding that heavy silver pen, I realized something profound. The fear had completely shifted. I was no longer terrified of what Della would do if I signed the paper. I was absolutely terrified of who I would become if I did not. If I put the pen down and walked out of this building, I would be telling Hazel that it was acceptable to let someone treat you like property as long as they paid the bills. I clicked the pen open. I pressed the tip to the paper and signed my name. Robin Lindgren Ashford. The ink flowed smooth and dark. I did not hesitate on the final loop of the letters. Margot took the paperwork back and slid it into her leather briefcase. She looked at me and the sharp lines of her face softened just a fraction. "You did the right thing," she said. "Now we have to protect the perimeter. When you go home today, you need to change your locks. Do not wait until the weekend. Change them today. And install a doorbell camera. If she decides to ignore the temporary order, we need proof. Unshakable proof." I nodded, standing up from the wooden bench. My legs felt remarkably steady. The stagnant air of the courthouse did not choke me anymore. I walked out through the heavy glass doors into the freezing March wind, and for the first time in a decade, my lungs filled all the way to the top. Wednesday afternoon brought a slight thaw to the neighborhood. The snow packed on the roof of our house had begun to melt in the pale sunlight. Fat drops of water dripped from the gutters, hitting the wooden planks of the front porch with a steady, rhythmic tapping sound. The afternoon sun reflected off the neighbors' windows across the street, casting long shadows over the dormant lawn. I stood on a small aluminum step stool by the front door. The March wind bit at my bare hands, but my grip on the screwdriver remained perfectly steady. I was driving the final mounting screw into the doorframe to secure the new camera Margot had told me to buy. The black plastic casing of the camera sat exactly at eye level. It had a wide-angle lens that captured the entire span of the porch and the front walkway. If Della Ashford stepped one single foot onto this property, the small device would send an alert directly to my phone, recording every second of her presence. The sound of tires crunching over wet gravel made me turn my head. Scott's car pulled into the driveway. He parked and turned the engine off, but he did not get out right away. He sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, staring through the windshield at me standing on the stool. Finally, the car door opened. He walked up the driveway with his shoulders hunched against the cold. His eyes immediately locked onto the black device mounted to the doorframe. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice carried a tight edge of disbelief. "I am installing a camera," I said simply. I stepped down from the stool and folded it flat. I did not look away from him. Scott looked at the camera, then looked at me. He ran a hand over his thinning hair, a gesture of pure frustration. A camera pointed at our front door. "Robin, she is my mother." I picked up the screwdriver and slipped it into my coat pocket. "She is also a woman who possesses a spare key to this house, and as of this morning, she is a woman with a restraining order filed against her. The camera stays." Scott stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. The space between us on the wooden porch felt wider than the frozen river downtown. His face looked pale and exhausted. I knew he wanted the conflict to just evaporate into the cold air. He wanted to wake up and find out the last 4 days had been a bad dream, so he could go back to letting his mother run our lives while he pretended everything was fine. "When did you become this person?" he asked softly. The question was not an attack. It was a genuine plea from a man who did not recognize the woman he had married. I looked at my husband. I thought about the girl from Duluth who had tried so desperately to fit into his wealthy, established family. That girl had smiled through insults and swallowed her own pride so many times she forgot what it tasted like. That girl was gone. When she poured wine on me in front of our daughter, I answered. My voice was calm, completely devoid of anger. That was the moment. Scott did not have a response to that. He looked at the ground, shoved his hands deep into his pockets, and walked past me. I listened to the new lock click open as he went inside the house. I stayed out on the cold porch for a few more minutes. I connected the camera to my phone application. The screen lit up with a live feed of the neighborhood. The image was crisp and clear. I tested the motion sensor by waving my hand in front of the lens. The phone in my pocket vibrated instantly. The perimeter was secured. Thursday arrived with a relentless schedule at the pediatric clinic. The waiting room was packed with toddlers fighting off the tail end of winter ear infections and grade schoolers needing sports physicals. The air smelled of sterile alcohol wipes, bubblegum-flavored amoxicillin, and the stale coffee brewing in the break room. I moved from exam room to exam room, checking temperatures, recording weights, and asking parents the same standard questions. The routine felt incredibly grounding. Taking care of other people gave me a safe place to put my nervous energy. During my lunch break, I sat at a small round table in the corner of the break room. I was staring at a turkey sandwich I had zero intention of eating. The muffled sound of a child crying 2 doors down echoed through the thin drywall. Petra walked into the room. She was wearing her blue scrubs, her stethoscope draped casually around her neck. She poured herself a cup of the terrible coffee, added 2 packets of sugar, and sat down in the plastic chair across from me. She did not offer empty platitudes. She just looked at me with her sharp, observant eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked. I picked at the crust of my bread. "I filed the paperwork yesterday. I changed the locks on the house. I installed a security camera on the front porch." I took a slow breath. Scott is barely speaking to me. He sleeps on the couch. He looks at me like I am a stranger who broke into his house. Petra took a sip of her coffee. She swallowed, set the mug down on the table, and leaned forward. "Robin, listen to me very carefully," she said. Her tone was completely serious. "You have been a nurse practitioner for 15 years. I have watched you work. You have documented every single patient interaction you have ever had, every vital sign, every minor medication, change every single conversation with a difficult parent. You are the best documenter I know. Your charts are flawless." I looked at her, not understanding where she was going with this. That is my job, Petra. It is medical protocol. Exactly, she leaned closer. So, tell me something. Why haven't you been documenting this? I opened my mouth, then closed it. I looked down at my hands. Because patients are strangers. Della is family. You do not document family. You do when family is the one hurting you, Petra countered firmly. You treat her like a mother-in-law, which means you give her the benefit of the doubt. You make excuses for her behavior. You let things slide because confronting them is too exhausting. But you cannot do that anymore. You need to treat this situation like a clinical case. You need to use your skills. Her words hit me like a physical weight. She was absolutely right. For a decade, I had allowed Della to manipulate the reality of our household because I refused to keep a formal record of her actions. I relied on my memory, and memory is a fragile thing when you are constantly being told you are too sensitive or ungrateful. Della kept a ledger of her money. I needed to keep a ledger of her behavior. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the digital notes application. The screen was blank and bright white. I created a new folder and titled it Incident Log. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard for a second. The background noise of the clinic seemed to fade away. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant crying, the chatter in the hallway, it all vanished. I tapped the screen. Date, time, description of event, direct quotes only, witnesses present. I created the very first entry. I typed in the date of my birthday party. I typed the exact time the wine hit my dress. I typed the 5 words Hazel had spoken. Then under the section for witnesses, I typed the name of the woman sitting across from me. I looked up from my screen. Petra was watching me with a small approving nod. She did not ask what I was typing. She already knew. Thank you, I said to her. Do not thank me, she replied, picking up her coffee mug and standing up from the table. Just keep typing. We have a lot of blank pages to fill. I watched her walk out of the break room. I looked back down at the glowing screen of my phone. The list was small right now, but it was real. It was tangible. I was no longer just surviving the chaos of the Ashford family, I was documenting it. And as any good nurse knows, if it is not documented, it did not happen. From this moment forward, every single thing Della Ashford did was going to happen on the record. The house was completely silent. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that only happens after midnight, when the rest of the world has surrendered to sleep. Thursday night had bled into Friday morning. Downstairs in the living room, Scott was asleep on the sofa, burying his face in a decorative pillow rather than looking at the empty space on the other side of our bed. Upstairs, Hazel was breathing softly in her room, safely tucked under her heavy quilt. I sat alone in the small spare bedroom I used as a home office. The only light came from the stark white rectangle of my laptop screen, casting a pale, unnatural glow across the inexpensive wooden desk I had assembled myself 5 years ago. I opened my email account. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a few seconds. The plastic keys felt cold under my fingertips. I clicked the search bar at the top of the screen and typed 2 words, Della Ashford. I hit the enter key. The screen flickered, loading a decade of correspondence. 847 results appeared in the upper right corner. For 10 years, I had treated these messages like normal family communication. I had read them, replied to them, and filed them away without a second thought. But sitting in the dark with my new understanding, the sheer volume of them felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I did not need to read all 847. I needed the architecture of her control. I clicked the advanced search options and began adding specific filters. I typed the word key. I typed the word condition. I typed the phrases my house and Hazel weekends. The list shrank rapidly. The screen refreshed, leaving exactly 73 emails. I clicked on the oldest one. It was dated March of 2017. The subject line was blank. The body of the email was short and direct. I expect a spare key. Family should always be able to reach each other. This is non-negotiable. I read the words non-negotiable 3 times. I remembered receiving that email 9 years ago. At the time, I had convinced myself she was just being a fiercely protective mother. I had actually felt a twisted sense of gratitude that she cared enough to want access to us. Now looking at those same words through the lens of everything that had happened, the illusion dissolved completely. It was not protection. It was a chain. I clicked the next highlighted message. January 2019. Since I am paying for Hazel's school, I think it is reasonable that she spends 2 weekends a month with me. Another click. April 2021. If you take Hazel to Colorado without discussing it with me first, I will need to reconsider my financial support. My jaw ached. I realized I had been clenching my teeth so hard the muscles in my neck were vibrating. I went through the emails one by one, downloading each message as a separate document, saving them into a single massive file on my desktop. I read text messages I had backed up from my phone. I paid for that kitchen. The least you can do is let me come over when I want. Every single dollar she had ever spent on us came with a string attached, and I was sitting in the dark pulling all the strings together until they formed a rope. At 11 o'clock that night, I attached the compiled file to a new email addressed to Margot Pryor. I kept my message brief. 73 emails, 10 years. Every dollar had a string. I hit send. I closed the laptop. The room plunged into total darkness, but I did not feel tired. I felt wide awake, buzzing with a strange cold energy. The arrows were gathered. We just needed to string the bow. When I woke up on Friday morning, the first thing I saw was a notification on my phone screen. An email from Margot sent at 6 o'clock in the morning. I am canceling my morning appointments. Bring everything to my office at 10. This is the strongest pattern I have seen in 5 years. The drive into downtown Minneapolis felt different today. The dirty snow piled along the sides of the highway was finally beginning to melt, leaving dark streaks of water running across the asphalt. The sky was a pale, clear blue. I carried a heavy canvas tote bag into the elevator on Hennepin Avenue. When I walked into Margot's office, she was already standing behind her large oak desk, clearing away a stack of legal pads to make room. I unpacked the tote bag. I placed the items on the polished wood, one by one, lining them up like surgical instruments on a sterile tray. First, the original blue leather ledger. Next, the gallon-sized plastic bag containing my ruined white cotton dress. The dark red stain looked almost black inside the sealed plastic. Beside the dress, I placed the time-stamped photograph Petra had taken of me standing in the living room. Then the folded copy of the police report. Finally, the thick stack of 73 printed emails. Margot looked at the items spread across her desk. She did not speak right away. She picked up the blue leather notebook. She opened it to a random page, her eyes tracing the neat columns of blue ink where Della had documented her own financial transactions and the conditions attached to them. In 22 years of practicing family law, Margot said, her voice unusually quiet, "I have never had a client hand me a ledger. The abuser kept themselves." She thought it was just accounting, I told her. I kept my hands folded in my lap, resisting the urge to reach out and touch the evidence. She genuinely believes she is just a meticulous record keeper. Margot closed the blue notebook. It is accounting. It is an exact chronological accounting of every single dollar she used to maintain power over your life. And a judge is going to read it exactly that way. She walked around the desk and pulled a large white whiteboard from the corner of the room, turning it so we both could see it. She picked up a black dry erase marker. Della's attorney is going to argue that the wine pouring was a one-time incident, Margot explained, uncapping the marker. They will say she was emotional, that family gatherings are stressful, and that you are overreacting to a ruined dress. We have to prevent them from isolating that event. We have to force the court to look at the entire 10-year timeline. Margot began writing on the board. First, we establish the physical assault. We submit the dress and Petra's time-stamped photograph. Second, the police report provides the official record. Third, we present the voicemails where she explicitly threatens your housing stability by bringing up the down payment. She drew a heavy black line under the list. Then we drop the weight on them. The 73 emails prove the pattern of coercion over a decade. And the grand finale is the ledger. It corroborates every single email. She documented her own coercive control. It is completely undeniable. I looked at the list on the whiteboard. It looked incredibly solid. It looked like a wall Della could not simply buy her way around. But Margot was still staring at the board, tapping the black marker against her chin. "We have a strong case for the protective order," Margot said slowly. "But physical evidence of the assault is only one piece. You said there were 23 guests in the room when she poured the wine. We need a witness, not your best friend from the clinic. We need someone who has no reason to take your side, someone objective who heard what she said before she poured the wine." I thought back to the party, the music playing, the sudden terrible silence, the faces staring at me. I tried to mentally place where everyone was standing in the kitchen and the living room. Karen had covered her mouth. Jim had taken a step backward. And then I remembered Lisa, Brad's wife. Brad was Scott's oldest friend. They had known each other since college. Lisa had been standing near the kitchen island, and I remembered seeing the reflection of the overhead lights on the back of her phone case. She had been holding her phone up. Her knuckles had been white. "Lisa," I said aloud. "Brad's wife. I think she was holding her phone the entire time. She might have recorded it." Margot turned to look at me. Are you absolutely sure? I am not sure if she recorded it, I clarified. But she had her phone up. Her hands were tense. She did not put it down until Della walked out the door. Find out, Margot instructed, putting the cap back on the marker. Call her. Meet her in person. If she has a video of the assault, and it includes audio of Della telling you that you do not belong in your own home, we do not just win this hearing. We destroy any chance she has of contesting it. Saturday morning brought a thick, gray, overcast sky to Street Paul. The air outside was damp and freezing, the kind of cold that seeps right into your bones. I sat at a small corner table inside a crowded coffee shop near the university. The windows were fogged up from the heat of the espresso machines and the bodies packed inside. The smell of roasted coffee beans and warm pastries was overwhelming. I wrapped both hands around a large ceramic mug of black tea, waiting. The bell above the glass door chimed. Lisa walked in. She was wearing a heavy, puffy coat and a thick wool scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She looked around the crowded room nervously before spotting me in the corner. She walked over her steps, hesitant and uneven. She did not take her coat off when she sat down in the chair across from me. She kept her hands buried deep in her pockets. Thank you for meeting me, I said gently. Lisa nodded. She looked at the table, then at the foggy window, then finally at me. I probably should not be here, Robin. Brad told me to stay out of it. He says this is family business and we are just going to get caught in the crossfire. Brad is Scott's friend, I replied, keeping my voice soft but steady. I understand his loyalty. I am not asking Brad to get involved. I am asking you. Lisa pulled one hand out of her pocket and began shredding a paper napkin into tiny, thin white strips. The pile of torn paper grew on the table between us. Scott's family is really powerful, Robin. Brad does a lot of contract work for Della's real estate firm. If she finds out I helped you. She let the sentence trail off, but the threat was perfectly clear. Della's influence did not just stop at the edge of our family. It extended into the community. It touched bank accounts and business contracts. I know what she can do, I said. I have lived under it for 10 years. But at the party right before the wine, you were holding your phone. Lisa stopped tearing the napkin. She pressed her lips together tightly. A full minute passed. The loud hiss of the milk steamer behind the counter filled the silence. Finally, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She unlocked the screen. She tapped a few times, her thumb shaking slightly, and then pushed the phone across the small table toward me. I looked down at the screen. It was a video file. I pressed play. The footage was slightly shaky, the camera angle tilted upward from chest height, but the picture was incredibly clear. There I was, standing in the center of my own living room, the balloons in the background, the music playing softly, and there was Della. She was holding the large crystal wine glass. The camera captured the exact expression on her face. It was not a face twisted by sudden rage or a loss of control. It was a face of absolute calculating coldness. The audio from the phone speaker was thin, competing with the noise of the coffee shop, but I could hear her voice perfectly. You do not belong here. And then the deliberate tilt of the wrist, the dark liquid cascading down the front of my white dress, the collective gasp from the room. The video lasted exactly 37 seconds. It ended right after Della set the empty glass down on the granite counter with a sharp final click. I stared at the black screen for a long time after the video stopped. Seeing it from the outside was entirely different than living it from the inside. From the inside, it had felt chaotic and humiliating. From the outside, looking at the screen, it looked exactly like what Margot had called it. An assault. A calculated demonstration of power. I slid the phone back across the table. I did not know what to do with it, Lisa whispered. She looked miserable. I have been sick about it all week. I watch it and I just feel awful, but Brad says it is not our place. I looked directly into her eyes. I did not raise my voice, but I did not soften it either. Brad was not the one standing in a wine-stained dress in front of his friends Lisa. Brad is not the one who has to explain to his 8-year-old daughter why her grandmother treats her mother like property. Lisa swallowed hard. Her eyes filled with tears, making them look bright and glassy in the dim light of the coffee shop. She looked down at the shredded napkin on the table. She looked at her phone. She looked at me. I can send it to you, she said softly. Can I forward it to my lawyer? I asked. It will become part of the court record. Your name will be attached to it. Lisa took a deep, shaky breath. She closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, the hesitation was gone. The fear was still there, but she had pushed past it. Send it to your lawyer. Brad will just have to deal with it. She picked up her phone. I watched her fingers move across the screen. A moment later, my own phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and opened the message. The video file was there, sitting securely in my inbox. "Thank you," I said. Lisa stood up, wrapping her thick wool scarf tighter around her neck. "Good luck, Robin. Truly." She turned and walked out of the coffee shop, disappearing into the cold gray morning. I sat alone at the table for a few more minutes. I listened to the hum of the conversations around me. I looked down at the video file on my phone. I had the ledger. I had the emails. I had the dress. And now I had the indisputable visual proof. The fear that had lived in my chest for a decade was completely gone, replaced by something hard and unbreakable. I tapped the screen and forwarded the 37-second video directly to Margot. I finished my tea, stood up, and walked out into the freezing wind, ready for whatever Della Ashford tried to do next. 72 hours passed without a single sound from Della Ashford. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday folded into each other, creating a strange, unmapped territory in my own home. There were no voicemails. There were no text messages, lighting up my phone screen in the middle of my shift at the clinic. There was no terrifying click of the spare key turning in the front door lock at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. For the very first time in 10 years, the morning did not begin with a knot of dread sitting heavy in my stomach. I stood in my kitchen on Thursday morning, watching the pale, late March sunlight filter through the window over the sink. The snow in Minneapolis was finally surrendering, melting into dark puddles on the driveway, and a few brave sparrows had returned to the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard. I held my coffee mug and simply listened to the house. The dishwasher hummed its low, steady cycle. Hazel chewed her toasted cereal, the crunching sound rhythmic and entirely normal. My phone sat completely dark and silent on the edge of the granite counter. I took a breath, and for the first time I could remember my shoulders actually dropped. The permanent tension that had locked my jaw and pulled my posture tight for a decade began to loosen. It was a physical unraveling. When I went into the clinic that afternoon, Petra noticed it immediately. She stopped me in the hallway outside exam room 4, holding a stack of patient charts against her chest. She looked at my face, her eyes narrowing in quiet observation. She told me I looked completely different, like someone who had finally pulled a deep, painful splinter out of their skin. But the peace I felt was a fragile, unfamiliar thing. It felt like standing in the exact center of a hurricane, enjoying the blue sky while knowing the back wall of the storm was still waiting just over the horizon. That evening, I came home to find Hazel sitting at the kitchen table with a sprawling pile of wax crayons scattered across the placemats. She was hunched over a piece of white construction paper, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in deep concentration. I set my work bag down on the chair and walked over to look over her shoulder. She had drawn a house. It was a tall building with square windows and a bright yellow door. Next to the house stood 3 stick figures: a tall woman with brown hair, a man standing next to her, a small girl in the middle. I looked at the edge of the paper, waiting to see the familiar looming figure of her grandmother that used to occupy the corner of every family portrait she drew. The corner was empty, but right next to the little girl, Hazel had drawn a brown lopsided shape with 4 legs and a long tail. We did not own a pet. I traced my finger in the air above the paper. "Who is that right there, sweetie?" Hazel did not stop coloring the green grass at the bottom of the page. "That is the dog we are going to get. When we move to the new apartment..." My breath hitched. I stared down at the messy crayon strokes. She had drawn the future. She had drawn the 2-bedroom apartment in Street, Paul, that I had put a deposit on the place I was preparing to move us into. She was not drawing the past, and she was not holding on to the heavy, suffocating presence of Della Ashford. Hazel was not afraid of losing her grandmother. She was actually looking forward to the empty space left behind. I realized then that I had spent years projecting my own fears onto my daughter. I had been terrified that a broken family would ruin her, but Hazel had known the truth since she was 5 years old. She knew who the boss was, and she was entirely ready to leave the boss behind. Scott walked through the back door an hour later. He dropped his laptop bag on the floor and stepped out of his heavy winter boots. We had been living in a tense, polite silence all week. He was sleeping on the sofa, and we only spoke when absolutely necessary regarding groceries or school pickup schedules. But tonight, he walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table across from me. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the quiet corners. "Mom has not called me," he said. His voice was flat, hollowed out by confusion. I kept my hands wrapped around a glass of water. "That is a good thing, Scott." He shook his head slowly, staring at the empty placemat in front of him. "She has never gone this long without calling me. Not once in 41 years. Even when she went on a cruise to Alaska, she found a way to call me from the satellite phone every single day. The court order is doing exactly what it is supposed to do, I told him gently. It is giving us space. Scott looked up at me, and the expression in his eyes was not relief. It was raw, unadulterated fear. Or maybe she is just planning something. His words hung in the warm air of the kitchen, instantly chilling the room. I stopped breathing for a second. Scott did not possess the vocabulary to explain his mother's psychological tactics, but he had survived her for 4 decades. He possessed a survival instinct. He knew the rhythm of the predator. Della did not retreat out of respect for the law. If she was quiet, it was only because she was calculating the exact angle of her next strike. As soon as Scott went upstairs to shower, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened the security application linked to the new camera on the front porch. I began scrolling backward through the recorded footage from the past 3 days. The mail carrier, a delivery driver dropping off a package, a neighbor walking a golden retriever. Then I stopped. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read Wednesday 3:47 in the afternoon. A black sedan was parked across the street from our house. The engine was running, indicated by the faint white exhaust curling up into the cold air. The windows were tinted dark, making it impossible to see the driver. The car sat there perfectly idle for 15 entire minutes. Then it slowly pulled away and disappeared down the street. I did not recognize the vehicle. Della drove a white luxury SUV, but the cold knot of dread returned to my stomach, pulling tight. I took a screenshot of the footage and sent it to Margot. Her reply came 3 minutes later. It could be absolutely nothing, or it could be her checking to see what time you get home. Keep the camera armed and the doors locked. The heavy silence finally broke on Thursday morning, but the noise did not come from Della. It came from every single person connected to her. My phone vibrated against my desk at the clinic. It was a voicemail from Scott's aunt, Ruth, Della's younger sister. I stepped into an empty supply closet, closed the door, and pressed the phone to my ear. Ruth's voice dripped with that specific brand of wealthy suburban condescension that masked vicious attacks as genuine concern. "Robin, honey," the voicemail began, accompanied by a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Della is absolutely devastated. She is heartbroken. She made a mistake at the party, we all know that, but a court order against your own mother-in-law, that is so incredibly extreme, sweetheart. Cannot you just be the bigger person and talk to her? You are tearing this family apart over a ruined dress." Before I could even process the message, a text arrived from Uncle Greg Scott's older brother, who lived in Rochester. He had sent it to a group chat, including me and Scott. "Mom has not eaten in 3 days. You are killing her with this legal nonsense. Drop the petition." By the time I left the clinic that evening, I had received 6 separate messages from various members of the extended Ashford family. Even Brad Scott's oldest friend had texted Scott to demand an explanation, claiming Della had called his wife crying hysterically. I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot, the engine idling to keep the heater running. I called Margot. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Her entire family is calling me," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and rising panic. "They are all repeating the exact same script. They say I am overreacting, that she is suffering terribly, and that I need to drop the protection order immediately. They are acting as proxies," Margot stated. Her clinical, detached tone was exactly what I needed to hear. The common term for this is flying monkeys. The abuser cannot contact you legally, so she sends other people to do the pressuring for her. It allows her to claim she has clean hands while still maintaining control over your environment. It is a highly coordinated pressure campaign. "What do?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel. "You document every single call," Margot instructed. "Write down the name, the exact time, and the summary of what they said. But you do not respond to a single one of them. The moment you engage, you give them ammunition to take back to her. Let them talk to a wall." I ended the call and rested my forehead against the cold leather of the steering wheel. I thought about my mother raising 3 children in a cramped trailer park in Duluth. She had worked double shifts just to keep the electricity turned on. We had absolutely nothing, but we never engaged in this kind of coordinated psychological warfare. The Ashfords had money, status, and beautiful homes, but underneath the polished hardwood floors and the expensive blazers, they operated like a cartel enforcing loyalty. Della was controlling the narrative from a distance, using the very concept of family as a weapon to force me back into submission. Friday night arrived, bringing a heavy, suffocating tension into the house. Scott had driven to Rochester to have dinner with his brother Greg. I had stayed home with Hazel, keeping the doors locked and the security camera application open on the kitchen counter. It was past 11 o'clock when the front door finally opened. Scott walked inside. The cold air swept in with him, carrying the sharp, undeniable smell of cheap beer and brown liquor. He took off his coat, carefully hanging it on the hook, with exaggerated precision, a clear sign he was trying to hide how much he had been drinking. He did not walk into the kitchen. He stood in the center of the living room, swaying just a fraction of an inch. I stepped out of the kitchen and stood in the hallway, crossing my arms over my chest. "Greg thinks you need to drop the protective order," Scott said to the empty room. He refused to look in my direction. "Greg does not live in this house," I replied evenly. Scott turned his head slowly. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them puffy and exhausted. "Neither does my mother anymore." "Is that not enough for you, Robin? She is 65 years old. She is sitting in that huge house entirely alone. She is terrified. She has not been served with that order for even a full 2 weeks, and she has already sent 6 different people to harass me," I fired back. I took a step into the living room, closing the physical distance between us. Is that the behavior of someone who is terrified, Scott, or is that the behavior of someone who absolutely refuses to respect a single boundary? Scott slumped down onto the arm of the sofa. He dropped his head into his hands, rubbing his palms aggressively over his face. "I was at the dinner. They all think you are destroying everything." Greg Ruth, Uncle Pete on the speakerphone. "They all think you are trying to erase her from our lives." "And what did you say to them?" I asked. The question hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. Scott dragged his hands down his face and looked at the floorboards. The silence stretched out for 10 agonizing seconds. I listened to the ticking of the wall clock. I listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. "I did not say anything," he finally whispered. I closed my eyes. The admission felt like a physical blow to my chest. I did not say anything. That single sentence summarized the entire 41 years of his existence. When his mother insulted my clothes, he did not say anything. When she poured dark red wine down the front of my dress in front of 24 people, he did not say anything. When his entire family sat around a dinner table and blamed his wife for trying to protect his child, he sat there, drank his beer, and did not say anything. His silence was not neutrality. His silence was active participation. By refusing to defend me, he was signaling to the entire Ashford family that I was standing completely alone on the battlefield. "I know," Scott mumbled, his voice cracking. "I know I should have spoken up. I do not know what I am supposed to do when she gets like this." I opened my eyes and looked down at my husband. He looked so small sitting there on the edge of the sofa. For the very first time, I did not just see a weak man. I saw the frightened little boy Della had carefully manufactured. She had spent 4 decades ensuring he never developed a spine, rewarding his compliance with money and punishing his independence with emotional withdrawal. She did not just control me with her blue ledger. She controlled him with a lifetime of conditional love. I understood the tragic mechanics of his paralysis, but understanding it did not mean I could survive it anymore. "You could have told them to stop," I said quietly. Scott let out a bitter, miserable laugh. "I have never told my mother to stop. Not once in my entire life. About anything." I walked over to the staircase. I placed my hand on the wooden banister. I felt a profound, heavy sadness settle into my bones. It was the sadness of realizing that you cannot save someone who refuses to learn how to swim. "I am not dropping the protection order, Scott," I said, looking back at him one final time. "The hearing is in 2 weeks. But I need to know something right now. When we walk into that courtroom, will you be sitting next to me, or will you be sitting across from me?" Scott looked up. His bloodshot eyes met mine. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He just stared at me, trapped halfway between the woman he married and the mother who owned him. I did not wait for the answer. I turned around and walked up the stairs, leaving him alone in the dark. The hum of the clinic always grounded me. It was Monday afternoon during the 3rd week of March. I was standing in exam room 4, pressing the cold bell of my stethoscope against the narrow chest of a 4-year-old boy. The room smelled of cherry-flavored cough syrup and the sharp, clean scent of sanitizing wipes. I listened to the steady rhythm of his heart and the clear rush of air in his lungs. For those 3 minutes, the world was perfectly manageable. Then the phone in the pocket of my white coat began to vibrate. It was not a short pulse for a text message. It was a long, continuous buzz. The specific alert for the security camera I had installed on my front porch. I smiled at the boy, pulled the stethoscope from my ears, and told his mother he was clear to go back to preschool. I stepped out into the busy hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I reached into my pocket and unlocked the screen. The live video feed loaded instantly. Della Ashford was standing on my front porch. She wore her immaculate gray tailored blazer. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged, defying the biting winter wind. A nude-colored designer purse hung rigidly from the crook of her left arm. In her right hand, she held a shiny brass key. My lungs stopped working. I leaned my shoulder heavily against the hallway wall. On the small screen, I watched her push the spare key toward the deadbolt. It slid in only halfway before hitting the new pins. I had paid a locksmith to change every lock on the house 5 days ago. Della pushed the key harder. Her knuckles turned stark white against the brass. She twisted her wrist, trying to force the mechanism. The heavy wooden door did not yield a single fraction of an inch. She pulled the key out, her lips pressed together into a thin, furious line. For a second, she looked confused. Then her eyes drifted upward. They locked perfectly onto the small black lens of the camera. She knew I was at work. She knew the application sent alerts directly to my phone. She stepped closer, her face filling the frame. "Robin," she said. The microphone picked up her voice with crystal clarity. It was slow, controlled, and dripping with absolute entitlement. "I know you are watching this. I came to get my ledger. It is my personal property. You have absolutely no right to keep it from me." Petra walked out of the supply room, holding a stack of patient files. She took one look at my face and stopped dead in her tracks. She walked over her eyes, dropping to the phone in my trembling hand. On the screen, Della was still speaking. "You think a piece of paper from a judge is going to keep me away from my own granddaughter? I built this family. I paid for that house you are standing in. That book belongs to me." Della turned around. The heels of her expensive shoes clicked sharply against the wooden porch steps. They were the exact same steps Scott had repaired by hand last summer, the materials for which Della had explicitly refused to pay. She walked with perfect posture down the driveway and climbed into her white luxury sedan. The timestamp on the recording read 2:14 in the afternoon. She had been on the property for exactly 5 minutes. "She went to your house," Petra whispered, staring at the screen, "with an active protection order in place." My thumb hovered over the screen. I did not say a word to Petra. I backed out of the application, opened my phone dialer, and called Margot Pryor. "She showed up," I said the second the line connected. My voice sounded thin and metallic. "On camera, with the spare key." She tried to get in. She talked directly to the camera and demanded the ledger. Margot let out a slow, heavy breath. "Robin, she just violated the order for protection on a recorded video feed. That is direct contempt of court. You need to understand what this means. This is her handing us the entire case on a silver platter." I hung up the phone and stood in the sterile hallway. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt like I had won. But I knew Della Ashford. She did not operate in a world where she simply lost. If she could not walk through the front door, she was going to find a way to tear down the walls. My instinct was completely correct. At 6 o'clock that evening, an email arrived in my inbox. It was forwarded from Margot. The original sender was Arthur Koenig, a high-profile family law attorney based in Street Paul. He was officially representing Della Ashford. The attached document was a formal petition filed under Minnesota statute, Chapter 257C.08. Della was suing for grandparent visitation rights. The stated reason on the petition was maternal alienation of the grandchild. She was formally accusing me of maliciously keeping Hazel away from her. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the glowing laptop screen. The temporary victory of the porch video evaporated into the cold air. She had not just violated the order, she had immediately launched a massive legal counterattack using the court system itself to punish me. Grandparent visitation in this state requires proving that denying access would actively harm the child, Margot explained over the phone later that night. With an active protection order against her, her lawyer is grasping at straws. No judge will grant it. But that is not the point of the filing, Robin. The point is to bleed you dry. It will cost you time, it will cost you sleep, and it will cost you money. The cost was already suffocating me. Margot billed $350 an hour. She had already logged 11 billable hours preparing the initial petition and reviewing the massive evidence file. Filing the contempt of court motion for the porch violation and drafting the response to the visitation lawsuit would require at least 20 additional hours. I opened a new tab on my browser and checked the balance of my secret savings account. $12,800. It had taken me 4 years of hiding away small pieces of my paycheck to build that safety net. Now I was watching it evaporate in a matter of weeks, but the financial bleeding was nothing compared to the toll it was taking upstairs. Hazel was changing. The vibrant, loud 8-year-old girl who loved to sing off-key in the car was slowly retreating into a shell. She stopped leaving her crayons scattered across the kitchen table. She started tiptoeing down the hallway, deliberately trying to make as little noise as possible. On Friday evening, I was folding laundry on the sofa when Hazel walked into the room. She stood near the edge of the rug, twisting the hem of her shirt in her small hands. "Is Grandma mad at us?" she asked quietly. I set the folded towel down. My heart fractured against my ribs. I patted the cushion next to me, and she climbed up, leaning her small weight against my side. Grandma just needs some time away, sweetie. Grown-ups have disagreements. It has absolutely nothing to do with you. Hazel looked down at her twisting fingers. It is always about me. That is what she said. The room spun. The air turned completely to ice. What do you mean, baby? When did Grandma say that? Whenever she came over, Hazel whispered. She told me that everything she buys is for me. The house, the school, the clothes. She said she works so hard just so I can have things. If she is mad, it means I did something wrong. I closed my eyes. A sickening wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. Della had not just controlled Scott and me. She had actively parentified my 8-year-old daughter. She had systematically burdened a child with the massive emotional weight of her financial transactions, turning Hazel into a captive audience for her grand narrative of sacrifice. Hazel had completely internalized the toxic idea that she was a burden, that every dollar spent was a debt she personally owed. The next morning, I called a specialized pediatric therapist in the city. The earliest available appointment was 2 weeks away. It would cost an additional $200 for every single session. My savings account was draining faster than water through a broken pipe. At work, Petra found me reviewing charts in the break room. She sat down, pulled a checkbook from her scrub pocket, and placed a silver pen on top of it. "Let me help," she said firmly. "I can cover the retainer for the new motions. You can pay me back next year, or in 5 years, or never. I do not care." I looked at the blue leather of her checkbook. The offer was beautiful. It was genuine, but I slowly pushed it back across the table. "I cannot take it, Petra," I said. My voice was thick, but my resolve was absolute. Every single dollar Della ever gave me came wrapped in a heavy iron chain. I spent 10 years drowning in obligations. I cannot start a new pattern of owing people money. Not even you. I have to buy my freedom with my own currency, or it will not mean anything. Petra studied my face for a long moment. She put the checkbook away, reached across the table, and squeezed my hand. The weekend arrived, dragging a suffocating blanket of isolation over the house. Scott moved through the rooms like a ghost. Ever since his admission on Friday night that he had sat silently while his family tore me apart in Rochester, the space between us had solidified into a brick wall. He slept on the couch. I slept in the bed. We did not speak. The extended Ashford family continued their relentless campaign. The text messages poured in from unfamiliar numbers, cousins and aunts I had spoken to maybe 3 times in a decade. I followed Margot's strict instructions. I took screenshots of every single message, documented the timestamps, and never replied. But the silence required a massive amount of energy. It felt like I was standing entirely alone in the center of an empty arena, holding up a heavy shield while stones rained down from every direction. Then came Monday morning, the 4th week of March. I woke up at 5 o'clock. The sky outside the bedroom window was pitch black. The house was freezing. I walked downstairs in my socks, avoiding the creaking floorboards by memory. I brewed a pot of dark coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The only light came from the small lamp over the stove. I unlocked my phone. There were 3 new notifications waiting on the screen. The first was an email from Margot. The judge officially scheduled the final hearing for the order of protection for March 28th, but Della's attorney had already filed a motion to dismiss the entire case. Koenig argued that pouring the wine was one isolated incident of emotional expression during a stressful family gathering and that the ledger was merely personal property, not evidence of domestic abuse. One isolated incident of emotional expression. That was how expensive lawyers described public humiliation and assault. The second notification was a text message from Scott's brother Greg. "Scott needs to come to Mom's 66th birthday dinner next week. If he does not show up, she will never forgive him. And she will never forgive you." I stared at the glowing words. They were still using me as the scapegoat. They still believed I was the puppeteer controlling Scott, completely blind to the fact that their mother was the only person pulling the strings. Before I could read the third notification, a small sound broke the silence. I turned my head. Hazel was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She was wearing her oversized fleece pajamas. Her arms were wrapped tightly around a stuffed bear. Her face was pale and dark, purple shadows bruised the delicate skin under her eyes. "Mommy," she whispered. Her voice shook. "I had the dream again. The one where Grandma takes me away and you cannot find me anywhere." The coffee mug slipped from my fingers. I caught it just before it tipped over hot liquid splashing onto the granite counter. I pushed the chair back, dropped to my knees on the cold floor, and pulled my daughter into my arms. Hazel did not cry loudly. She cried the exact way I used to cry when I was her age. Silent, shuddering gasps burying her face into my shoulder so nobody else would hear the noise. She was trying to take up as little space as possible. She was learning how to suffer in complete silence. I held her tightly, staring at the dark wood cabinets over her shoulder. 3 generations of women. My mother had suffered the crushing weight of poverty in a trailer park, crying silently over empty bank accounts. I had suffered the crushing weight of conditional wealth-swallowing insults to keep a roof over my child's head. And now Hazel was inheriting the exact same posture of submission. The pattern was passing down through the bloodline like a genetic disease. My desire to simply keep the family intact shattered completely. Keeping the family intact meant keeping the disease alive. Mommy Hazel mumbled into my collarbone. "Are we still going to the new apartment?" "Yes, baby," I said, stroking her messy brown hair. "We are definitely going. With the dog, with the dog." She pulled her head back and looked at me with her wide, exhausted eyes. "Is Daddy coming with us?" I looked at the doorway leading to the living room where Scott was sleeping under a thin blanket. I thought about his silence at the dinner table. I thought about his inability to stand up to the woman who was currently giving his daughter nightmares. "I do not know yet, sweetie," I answered truthfully. Hazel wiped her nose with the back of her small hand. She looked at me for a long time. Then she took a deep, shuddering breath and said 5 words that completely rearranged the gravity in the room. "It is okay if he does not. You are enough." The air left my lungs. The walls of the kitchen seemed to pull back, expanding the space around us. You are enough. I had spent 39 years waiting for someone to give me permission to simply exist without owing them a debt. I waited for my mother to say it. I waited for Scott to say it. I waited for Della to say it. And here, in the freezing dark of a Monday morning, my 8-year-old daughter handed it to me. The old, frightened version of Robin Lindgren died on the kitchen floor right then. The shell cracked open, and the woman who stood up was made of something much harder than patience. At 8 o'clock, the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting cold yellow light across the oak floors. I was putting Hazel's lunchbox into her backpack when I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Scott walked into the kitchen. He was fully dressed in his work clothes. He did not look at the floor. He walked straight to the island counter and stopped a few feet away from me. His hands were out of his pockets. They hung loosely at his sides. "I made a phone call last night," he said. His voice was raspy, but it did not waver. "After you went to sleep, I called Greg. I told him I am not coming to the birthday dinner next week." I stopped zipping the backpack. I looked up at him. I did not say anything. I just waited. Scott swallowed hard. He looked at Hazel, who was putting her shoes on by the back door, and then he looked back at me. And I told him that when the hearing happens on the 28th, I will not be sitting in the gallery. I will be sitting at the plaintiff table, next to you, not across from you. I stared at my husband. I did not throw my arms around him. I did not cry tears of joy. 10 years of cowardice could not be erased by a single morning of bravery. The damage was too deep, the foundation too cracked. But as I looked at his hands resting openly at his sides for the first time in his life, I gave him a very small, slow nod. It was a start. It was the absolute bare minimum, but he was finally stepping onto the battlefield. I picked up the backpack and walked over to the door. I handed it to Hazel. She swung it over her shoulders and grabbed the brass doorknob. Before she turned it, she looked back over her shoulder at her father. "Daddy," she said, her young voice echoing slightly in the hallway. "Are you coming to the new apartment too?" Scott stepped forward. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I am going to try, Hazel. I am really going to try." Hazel looked at him with the brutal, unforgiving honesty only a child possesses. "Okay," she said simply. "Try harder." She opened the door and walked out into the cold March morning. I followed my daughter down the driveway toward the car, leaving Scott standing in the doorway of the house his mother bought, finally realizing how much it actually cost. 11 o'clock arrived on Tuesday night, blanketing the house in a heavy, suffocating silence. 4 days remained until the hearing in Hennepin County Family Court. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Hazel was deeply asleep, her small chest rising and falling in the dark. Scott was asleep too. He had finally moved off the living room sofa and returned to our bed, but we lay on opposite edges of the mattress, like 2 strangers sharing a life raft. We did not touch. The space between us felt wide and deep, filled with 41 years of his conditioned fear and 10 years of my accumulated resentment. I could not close my eyes. My mind was racing, spinning through legal statutes and bank balances. I slipped out from under the heavy quilt, my bare feet hitting the cold oak floor. I walked down the hallway to the small spare room I used as a home office. I turned on the small desk lamp. It cast a weak yellow circle of light over the wooden surface. I opened my laptop, the screen flaring bright white in the dim room, and clicked on the email Margot had forwarded to me earlier that afternoon. It was the official motion to dismiss filed by Arthur Koenig, Della Ashford's attorney. I read the second paragraph for the fifth time. The defense explicitly cited the event at the birthday party as one isolated incident of emotional expression during a stressful family gathering. I stared at those words. Emotional expression. Della had stood in front of 24 people, looked me dead in the eyes, told me I did not belong in my own home, and poured a glass of dark red wine down my chest with the slow, deliberate precision of an executioner. To the legal team representing her wealth, that was simply an emotional expression. It was a perfectly sanitized phrase designed to erase the humiliation, to shrink the violence down into something acceptable. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair. The shadows in the room stretched tall against the walls. A terrible, hollow exhaustion settled deep into my bones. I thought about the massive cost of this fight. Over $10,000 of my secret savings had already evaporated into legal retainers and court filing fees. Hazel was waking up with dark circles under her eyes, crying about nightmares where her grandmother took her away and I could not find her. My husband was barely holding himself together, standing on the absolute edge of a breakdown, because he had finally chosen to disobey the woman who built his entire reality. And waiting on the other side of the battlefield was a woman with a private attorney, a real estate empire, and an extended family acting as her personal army. A dark, insidious thought crept into the back of my mind. The thought whispered that I could simply stop. I could open my phone right now and draft an email to Margot. I could tell her to withdraw the petition for the order of protection. I could call Della in the morning, offer a hollow apology for overreacting, and accept the blame for the ruined party. I could give her back a shiny new spare key to the front door. If I did that, the legal bills would instantly vanish. The Ashford family would stop sending threatening text messages. Scott could breathe again. We could go back to the way things were. It would be peaceful. It would be safe. But I looked around my small office, and the illusion of that safety began to rot. I looked at the inexpensive wooden bookshelves against the wall. I had bought them with my own paycheck and assembled them myself on a Saturday afternoon. I looked at the framed photograph sitting on the corner of the desk. It was from my graduation day when I officially became a nurse practitioner. My mother stood next to me in the picture, wearing the nicest blouse she could find at a discount store in Duluth. She had taken a bus all the way down to the city just to watch me cross the stage. I looked at my coffee mug sitting next to the frame. The rim carried a faint smudge of my pale nude lipstick. It was not bold red. I never wore bold red because bold red was Della's signature color, and I had unconsciously spent a decade trying not to compete with her. My eyes moved to the middle drawer of the desk. I knew exactly what was inside it. My brain never lost track of where things were buried. I reached out and pulled the drawer open. Underneath a stack of blank printer paper and old clinic schedules, I found the folded piece of white construction paper. I lifted it out and laid it flat under the yellow light of the desk lamp. The edges were slightly wrinkled. The waxy colors of the crayons had faded just a fraction. It was the picture Hazel had drawn in kindergarten exactly 3 years ago. She had titled it My Family. 3 stick figures stood under a blue sky. A tall woman, a man, and a little girl. There was no grandmother hovering over them. The teacher had written a small note in the bottom right corner using a gray pencil. Hazel says Grandma is not family. Grandma is the boss. I stared at the clumsy, beautiful crayon strokes. My daughter had been 5 years old. She had possessed the profound, terrifying clarity to see the exact structure of our lives. She had seen the truth, and she had spoken it aloud to her teacher. And what had I done? I had taken the drawing, folded it in half, hidden it in the bottom of a desk drawer, and forced my daughter to endure another 3 years of psychological control. 1,095 days. That was how long I had ignored the truth my child tried to show me. I had convinced myself that my silence was a shield. I believed that by swallowing Della's insults and accepting her financial strings, I was protecting Hazel from the trauma of a broken family. Sitting in the quiet dark, the central lie of my entire adult life completely shattered. My silence had never protected anyone. It had only provided Della with a quiet, comfortable room to operate in. By keeping the peace, I had actively taught my daughter that women are supposed to shrink themselves to fit into the spaces powerful people allow them to occupy. I was teaching her how to be small. I was passing down the exact same generational trauma my mother had suffered in the trailer park, just wrapped in expensive hardwood floors and private school tuition. I picked up my phone. I scrolled back through my messages until I found the text Petra had sent me on the night of the birthday party. Belonging to yourself is not the same as belonging to no one. The words finally clicked into place. I had spent 10 years desperately trying to belong to the Ashford family, because I was terrified of being an orphan again. I believed leaving them meant I would be entirely alone in the world. But looking at Hazel's drawing, I realized I did not need Della Ashford's conditional acceptance. I did not need to belong to her system. I needed to belong to myself because if I did not claim my own freedom, Hazel would never know she was allowed to claim hers. I did not put the drawing back into the drawer. I took a piece of clear tape and secured the construction paper directly to the wall right next to my graduation photograph. 2 pictures side by side. The woman I had worked so hard to become and the family my daughter actually wanted to build. I sat back down at the laptop. The exhaustion was completely gone. In its place was a cold, sharp focus. I hit the reply button on Margot's email. The digital clock in the corner of the screen read 11:47. Margot, I typed, I am not dropping a single thing. I will see you on Thursday morning to prepare for the trial. And when we get into that courtroom, I want to read the ledger aloud. I want to read every single page, every condition, every dollar. Let the judge hear exactly what her generosity sounds like when you read the fine print. I sent the message. I closed the computer. I walked back upstairs to the bedroom, slipped under the heavy quilt, and for the first time in 10 years, I fell asleep without carrying the weight of Della Ashford's expectations. Thursday morning brought a fierce, bright sun that reflected blindly off the remaining patches of snow in downtown Minneapolis. I sat in Margot Pryor's office, leaning forward in the heavy wooden chair. The whiteboard from last week was completely covered in black marker ink. Margot was pacing slowly behind her desk, her hands clasped behind her back. Koenig is going to try to paint this as a simple family disagreement that got out of hand, Margot said, her voice sharp and commanding. He wants the judge to focus entirely on the wine. We cannot let him control the boundaries of the narrative. We are playing offense today. She stopped pacing and tapped the whiteboard. Here is the exact sequence of our evidence. We open with the dress and Petra's time-stamped photograph. That establishes the physical reality of the assault. Then we submit the police report, which grounds the event in an official public record. I nodded, following the logic. Next, we introduce Lisa's video, Margot continued. 37 seconds of undeniable proof. The judge will see the deliberation in Della's movements. She will hear the words, "You do not belong here." That destroys the defense's claim of a sudden emotional loss of control. Then we pivot to the present day. We show the Ring doorbell footage from your porch. She deliberately violated the temporary order, tried to use the spare key, and explicitly demanded her financial records back on camera. And the voicemails, I asked. They come right after the video, Margot confirmed. We play the audio where she threatens your housing stability and calls you a girl from a trailer park. We establish the absolute financial leverage. Then we submit the highlights from the 73 emails showing the judge that this behavior spans a full decade. Margot walked over to her desk and picked up the blue leather notebook. She held it with both hands. And then, Robin, we bring out Exhibit G, the original ledger. You said in your email you want to read it aloud. I do, I answered. My voice was completely steady. I do not want you to summarize it for the court. I want to hold the book. I want to read the dates, the amounts, and the conditions. I want her to have to sit in a quiet room and listen to her own accounting system weaponized against her. Margot looked at me over the rim of her thick glasses. A slow, genuine smile broke across her usually stern face. I have been practicing family law for 22 years. I have been waiting a very long time for a client to ask me to do exactly this. She set the book down and leaned against the edge of the desk. There is one more critical piece to this strategy. If we execute this perfectly, we do not just win the 2-year protection order. I am filing a motion to hold her in direct contempt of court for the porch violation. If Judge Lehman grants the protection order and finds her in contempt, Della will face a massive fine, and that contempt charge goes permanently onto her public record. I thought about Della's pristine reputation in the wealthy suburbs of Edina. A public court record documenting domestic abuse and legal contempt would absolutely devastate her social standing. What happens to her petition for grandparent visitation, I asked, remembering the second lawsuit hovering over my head. It dies on the vine, Margot said firmly. No judge in Hennepin County is going to grant unsupervised visitation rights to an individual who just had a full protection order granted against them, who was just held in legal contempt for violating a temporary order, and who kept a 10-year ledger, documenting the financial coercion of the child's parents. Her own attorney will beg her to withdraw the petition to save whatever dignity she has left. I looked at the blue notebook on the desk. All the fear I used to feel when I saw that book was gone. It was no longer a symbol of my debt. It was the key to my absolute freedom. Friday night descended over the house with a quiet, solemn gravity. The hearing was less than 12 hours away. The house was spotless. I had packed my dark navy blazer and a crisp white blouse. I lay in the dark bedroom staring up at the invisible ceiling. The shadows from the street lamp outside played slowly across the walls. The mattress shifted slightly. Scott was lying on his back, staring at the same ceiling. He had been quiet all evening. He had declined 3 phone calls from his brother. He had turned his phone completely off at 9 o'clock. In the darkness, I felt a slight movement near my side. Scott shifted his arm. His hand slid slowly across the cool cotton sheets until the side of his hand gently brushed against mine. He did not grab my fingers. He did not pull me toward him. He just let his hand rest against mine, a silent, fragile anchor in the middle of the night. I did not pull away. I let him stay there. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. I realized with a profound sense of clarity that I was not afraid of facing Della tomorrow morning. I was not afraid of her lawyer, and I was not afraid of the judge. I was afraid of a completely different trap. I was afraid that when I looked at her sitting in that courtroom stripped of her power and exposed to the public, I would feel sorry for her. My old instinct as an orphan was to fix broken things. I knew the specific agonizing pain of being abandoned. Della was 65 years old. She lived alone. She had spent her entire life building an empire of control, and tomorrow she was going to watch her only son testify against her under oath. If I let pity into my heart, it would soften my resolve. Pity would make me hesitate. I closed my eyes and actively crushed the empathy down. I replaced it with the image of Hazel standing in the kitchen doorway, clutching her stuffed bear, crying over nightmares she should never have had to carry. Protecting my daughter was my only job. Pitying Della Ashford was a luxury I simply could not afford. "Are you ready?" Scott whispered into the darkness. His voice barely disturbed the quiet room. I looked toward the window, watching the shadows slowly shift across the glass. I thought about the white dress, the blue ledger, and the long, silent decade that had brought us to this exact moment. "I have been ready for 3 years," I whispered back. "I just did not know it until now." The air inside courtroom 4B of the Hennepin County Family Court smelled of heavy lemon floor wax, old paper, and stale coffee. It was a remarkably small room, entirely lacking the dramatic mahogany gallery boxes or sweeping ceilings you see on television. I sat at the petitioner's table beside Margot Pryor. I wore a dark navy blazer I had bought for myself at a department store for $89. My hands rested perfectly flat on top of the thick evidence binder. Across the narrow aisle, Della Ashford sat beside her high-profile attorney Arthur Koenig. She wore her immaculate gray blazer and real pearl earrings. Her posture was rigidly straight. The Honorable Patricia Lehman sat high behind the bench, flanked by the state and national flags. She was 58 years old, with short gray hair, rimless glasses, and the completely flat, unreadable expression of a woman who had spent decades listening to the absolute worst parts of human nature. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Scott walked in. Della turned her head. A tight, confident smile stretched across her face, anticipating that her son would take his rightful place directly behind her. Scott did not look at her. He walked slowly down the center aisle and took a seat in the wooden pew directly behind my chair. The confident smile vanished from Della's face instantly. For one fleeting second, the pristine mask cracked, revealing a flash of absolute shock before her lips pressed into a hard, furious line. Margot stood up. She did not waste the court's time with dramatic opening statements. She simply presented the foundation of our reality. She submitted Petra's time-stamped photograph of my ruined white dress, followed immediately by the official police report documenting the 5th-degree assault. Koenig immediately stood, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He argued smoothly that his client was a retired professional with no criminal history and that the event was merely a family disagreement blown wildly out of proportion. Judge Lehman did not even look up from her paperwork. She told Koenig she would determine what constituted an assault and instructed Margot to proceed. Margot played Lisa's 37-second video recording on the court's laptop. The audio filled the small room. "You do not belong here." Then the deliberate splash of the wine. Next came the Ring doorbell footage showing Della standing on my front porch 9 days after the temporary order was granted, holding the spare key and demanding her ledger back. Koenig tried to argue she was simply retrieving personal property. Judge Lehman asked if a formal motion had been filed to retrieve said property. When Koenig stayed silent, the judge noted the violation. Your Honor, Margot said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute authority. I would like to present Exhibit G, a personal ledger maintained by the respondent herself. Margot handed the blue leather notebook to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. My client would like to read selected entries from this ledger aloud, Margot stated. These are entries written in the respondent's own handwriting. Judge Lehman looked down at me and nodded. Proceed. I stood up. I held the certified copies of the pages in my hands. They did not shake. My voice was calm and steady, falling into the familiar measured cadence of a nurse reading clinical charts. March 2016, I read. $40,000. Down payment Birchwood Lane. Condition attached. A spare key must be provided, access anytime, no advance notice required. The courtroom was completely silent except for the low hum of the ventilation system. Judge Lehman made a small checkmark on her copy with her pen. September 2017. $2,100. Hardwood flooring installation. Condition attached. I choose the color and the contractor. January 2019. $8,000. Hazel's tuition at Edgewater Academy. Condition attached. Hazel spends a minimum of 2 weekends monthly at my home. I read 7 specific entries. With every dollar amount and every attached string, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Across the aisle, Della's breathing became rapid and shallow. Her knuckles were stark white as she gripped a pen. April 2021. $500 monthly stipend. Condition attached. No out-of-state travel with Hazel without my prior approval. Those were gifts. Della shot up from her chair. The sudden explosion of sound shattered the quiet room. Koenig immediately reached out and grabbed her arm to pull her down, but she violently jerked away from him. I gave them everything, she shouted, her voice trembling with genuine, unfiltered rage. The house, the floors, the school. And this is how she repays me, miss. Ashford. Judge Lehman barked. Sit down. Della could not stop. Her entire psychological framework was under attack, and her automatic defense mechanisms fired wildly. I never controlled anyone. Everything I did was out of love. Robin has always been unstable. She grew up in a trailer park. She does not understand how a family works. She does not understand generosity. I am the victim here. I gave hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I am being punished for it. I looked at the woman standing across the aisle. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving under her perfectly tailored blazer. She was not acting. She absolutely believed every single word she had just screamed. In her reality, she was the martyr. A sharp, painful twist of pity tightened in my chest for 2 seconds. Then the image of Hazel clutching her stuffed bear and crying about nightmares flashed behind my eyes. I crushed the pity into dust. Miss Ashford, Judge Lehman said. Her voice was cold enough to freeze water. I have asked you to sit down. If you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed from this courtroom. Della slowly sank back into her wooden chair. Koenig scribbled rapidly on his legal pad and shoved the paper directly in front of her. Stop talking! Della stared at the handwritten note. For the first time in 30 years, she obeyed an instruction. Your Honor, Margot said, calmly stepping forward. I would like to call Scott Ashford to the stand. Della turned her head. The anger on her face vanished, replaced instantly by absolute unadulterated horror. Her son was her creation. He was her property. He was not supposed to walk to the front of the room, raise his right hand, and swear an oath to tell the truth against her. Scott sat down in the witness box. His hands were not buried in his pockets. They rested flat and open on the wooden railing. Mr. Ashford, Margot began gently. Did you witness the incident on March 15th? Yes, Scott answered. His voice was low but perfectly clear. My mother poured wine on my wife at her birthday party. Did you intervene? No, he said softly. I did not. Why not? Scott took a slow breath, his chest expanding. Because I have never once in my life told my mother to stop. About anything. She decided what I wore to school. She decided what college I attended. She decided what neighborhood we bought a house in because she was paying the down payment. When she poured the wine, I froze. The way I have always frozen. Did your mother use financial support as a means of control over your household? Yes. Everything came with conditions. The money for the school, the spare key. I did not see it as control then. I saw it as my mother being my mother. When did you begin to see it differently? Scott looked up. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at his mother. He looked directly across the room at me. When my 8-year-old daughter said, Mommy already packed our bags. And I realized my daughter was braver than me. She was 8, and she could say what I could not say in 41 years. The courtroom was entirely silent. Koenig did not ask to cross-examine him. There was nothing left to defend. I looked at Della. The rigid mask had fallen completely away. Her face was entirely blank. It looked like a vacant room after all the furniture had been stripped away. The central pillar of her empire had just stood up and removed himself from the foundation. The collapse was absolute. Judge Lehman looked down at the files on her bench. I have heard enough. I am prepared to rule. She folded her hands together. Based on the evidence presented, including the respondent's own handwritten ledger, documenting financial conditions attached to familial support, testimony of the petitioner's spouse, photographic and video evidence of the physical assault and surveillance footage of a clear violation of the SPANGA temporary order, I find that the respondent has engaged in a sustained pattern of domestic abuse. The order for protection is granted for a period of 2 years effective immediately. The respondent is prohibited from contacting the petitioner, the minor child, or entering the petitioner's residence. Additionally, the court finds the respondent in contempt for violation of the temporary order. The respondent is ordered to pay a fine of $1,000. Regarding the respondent's petition for grandparent visitation, the petition is denied. It is not in the best interest of the minor child to grant visitation to an individual subject to an active protection order. With every single sentence, Della seemed to shrink. Her shoulders curled inward. Her hands rested flat on the wooden table, her pearl earrings shaking slightly, as a faint tremor ran through her neck. She had lost her son, her granddaughter, and her pristine reputation. The narrative of the generous matriarch was officially dead, replaced by a permanent court record of domestic abuse. Margot squeezed my arm. I stood up, gathered my purse, and walked down the aisle toward the heavy wooden doors. As I pulled the door open, I looked back through the small square window into the courtroom. Koenig was packing his briefcase and walking away. Della remained seated at the long wooden table. She was entirely alone. Her expensive Prada purse sat on the chair beside her, looking small and insignificant under the harsh fluorescent lights. I stepped out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight. The thick snow of the Minnesota winter had finally melted away. The air carried the sharp, wet scent of waking earth. Scott was standing near his car, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. I walked over and stood next to him. We did not embrace. We just stood together in the cold, fresh air. I am sorry it took me this long, he said softly. It took me 10 years, Scott, I replied, looking down the busy street, and 3 more after Hazel told me the truth. What now? Now we go pick up our daughter from school, I said, and we tell her the truth. Not all of it, just enough. What is enough? That Grandma will not be coming to the house anymore, and that it is not Hazel's fault, and that Mommy and Daddy are going to try. Scott nodded. It was not a magical fairy tale ending. It was hard work, but it was honest. Later that afternoon, I sat in the driver's seat of my car, waiting outside Edgewater Academy. The school bell rang at 3:15. Children poured out of the building. Hazel ran across the sidewalk, her backpack bouncing behind her. She had a sticker of a dog pressed onto the front pocket. She pulled the car door open and climbed into the back seat. Mommy, she asked, settling into her seat. How was your day? I looked at her in the rearview mirror. Her brown hair was messy, and her bright eyes looked straight back at me without dropping. My day was good, baby, I said, putting the car into drive. My day was really good. I rolled the windows down just an inch to let the crisp spring air inside. A new song played on the radio, an upbeat track, completely different from the sad melody of the birthday party. Hazel began to sing along. She missed the notes, she scrambled the lyrics, and she sang as loudly as she possibly could. I did not ask her to be quiet. I drove away from the curb, keeping my hands perfectly steady on the steering wheel and my shoulders pulled back, finally leaving the shadows entirely behind us. Sometimes the absolute heaviest chains we carry are not made of iron and they are not forged in anger. Instead, they are carefully woven out of bank transfers, generous down payments, and the suffocating expectation of endless gratitude. Have you ever found yourself biting your tongue, swallowing your own dignity, and shrinking yourself down to keep the peace simply because someone else was paying the bills? Robin's journey serves as a powerful reminder of a truth that is incredibly difficult to face when you are standing in the exact middle of it. Financial control is one of the most effective, insidious, and widely ignored forms of domestic abuse. When a family member uses their money, their lavish gifts, or their constant financial support to purchase the right to cross your personal boundaries, to dictate how you raise your children, or to tell you how you should behave in your very own home, they are not actually offering you their love. They are handing you a strict business contract disguised as affection. The most vital lesson you can take away from this story is that you always have the absolute, undeniable right to refuse the terms of that contract. Drawing a hard, immovable line to protect your own mental health and to secure the emotional safety of your children does not ever make you an ungrateful person. It makes you a fierce protector. A healthy family will never ask you to trade your personal autonomy and your self-respect in exchange for a roof over your head. Walking away from a safety net of financial security is undeniably terrifying, and building your own ground to stand on from scratch is deeply exhausting work. But the temporary pain of claiming your independence will always be much cheaper than the permanent soul-crushing cost of your quiet submission. Take a moment to look back at the complex relationships in your own life. Have you ever been trapped by a generous gift that ultimately felt much more like a locked cage? Have you ever had to make the agonizing choice between maintaining your financial stability and keeping your own dignity intact? Please find the courage to share your story with us in the comments section below. Your unique experiences carry profound weight, and speaking your quiet truth today might be the exact spark of strength another woman desperately needs to hear, so she can finally hand back the spare keys and walk out her own front door.